Do, do, do. Do, do, do. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Good, 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 good. I feel like I always have to finish with my mic. I always feel like I have to finish with my microphone. Get it right. Good morning. Let's see. 15. So we still have people coming in. It's 11 o'clock, but let's go ahead and wait a moment as people come on in. We got 17 out of 23. How's everyone doing today? You're back, so I didn't scare anyone off just yet. Can everyone see the PowerPoint as far as the title screen? Okay, good. We're going to have discussion today, so if you'd like, you can unmute your microphones when we get to discussion of the commercial, as well as you have questions. Just feel free to unmute and then just say, oh, I have a question or I have an idea. Be careful not to speak over others, just so that way we could be conscientious. There might be lags here and there, and so we'll do our best. And of course, if you feel comfortable, feel free to jump on camera. You don't have to. Let's see. Still at 17. Wait about one more minute. Anyone have any pets joining us today? Any plants joining us as well? Yes, Dee Dee. Ah, a cat. My door is closed today because my mom is working from home, and so Raven will not be visiting us. Last time she hid under the bed, I think she was uncomfortable with me speaking to random specters out there. A dog, a bird? What's your bird's name? A stuffed bison. Does your stuffed bison have a name? Pebbles, protect Pebbles. My nephew had a dog when he was younger. Being 7 years old at the time, he named that dog Pickles. And his mother was very kind of cross about that. Let's see. Spicy, best name. We're gonna go ahead and get started. It's 11:02, and I do want to see if I could give you guys a break during the class or end a bit early. Does anyone have a preference whether we have a break or we end like 10 minutes early? Just go ahead and kind of shout it out in the chat room there or microphone. Okay, so let's see if we can end by 11:10, if not 11. Today is going to be about going deeper into semiotics and disability studies. We should have read the article Enabling Whom by Minnick. As well, we should have all watched the commercial by St. Jude's Shriners Hospital. And that'll be towards the end of the lecture as we kind of work through the deeper kind of discussion of semiotics and looking at media and culture. I'm going to go ahead and move to the first slide here. I'm going to lower everything that I have. Can you see the chat? Like, is the chat blocking anything on the PowerPoint, or can you see the PowerPoint in full?
We just show.
Sorry?
It doesn't show.
Oh, the chat doesn't show. It's just the full PowerPoint.
Yeah, we don't see anything else except just the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, thank you. I was watching Suspiria the other day with a colleague, and his chat room was showing, and I was like, wait, what? Why is there this like random gray block? But looking at the schedule for today, we're going to be discussing the readings, some general thoughts, answer questions, have a dialogue about it, and then we'll get deeper into what is disability, what is disability in as far as culture, media, semiotics, and really how is it a way of disabling people by labeling them as otherwise. As well, we'll eventually get into writing across academia. I'll be looking at structure and how to structure your paragraphs, your essay, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers, hopefully on the first essay. I know several of you have emailed me about that already or have had Zoom calls with me. And so I do want to answer questions as we get to them within the lecture. At any point that you feel you have a question, feel free to stop me, whether in the chat or flag me down through voice. Voice will kind of be like the voice from God. I'll be like, oh, who is that? And so we'll have a chance to answer those questions a little bit more accessibly, whereas in chat, I might miss the question. I'll try my best. So moving into the next slide, does anyone have any questions right now and as far as housekeeping? So that could be about the syllabus, the course, how I'm going to be grading papers, how am I going to be giving you feedback and comments. I did go through half of the writing assignments that were submitted to me. And so half of you should have feedback already, but this is open to you. Any questions out there, any concerns? Any thoughts on the readings before we get into that? You seem pretty good. Just looking at the chat and the camera light. Okay. Somebody give me a sign that I can move forward. Okay. So if you do have a question that comes up, just flag me down, stop me, and we'll go ahead and address that as best as possible. So moving forward from housekeeping, let's go ahead and discuss the reading on semiotics. Now, this is the reading that I was like, I can't find a PDF of the textbook Science of Life in the USA. However, this article, it's more of a pedagogical reading for like instructors, really goes into how semiotics works within media, culture, and in the classroom. How is it that we would start to analyze signs, icons, and their connotations, as well as their denotations. And so, and as far as semiotics, we want to think about signs within culture as tools that are used to create particular cultural mythologies or ideology as we know it more today. But a sign can be anything that carries a meaning. So it can be an object like a Starbucks cup. It could be a car like Ford versus Toyota. It could be a dog, a cat, a robot, or even colors and music. And some music, let's say for instance, create or carries different connotations than others. And so if somebody's at a party and says, I like hip hop, somebody will say, why do you like hip hop? That question itself carries a connotation that is informed by racism, classism, and let alone people oftentimes racialize and view hip hop as less than other music. And so you want to look at how these things within culture and society carry a meaning in some form or manner. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? Or maybe have a sign that they want to bring up to think through a little bit? Give you a moment to write down some notes. So a sign that I frequently go to, it would be, let's see, I have a whole list of signs that I could pick from. So I like to go to lawns. Lawns, like your front gardens, typically operate as a sign of like suburban domestic middle class, of community, of the neighborhood, of relationships, but also nature. Like we live in a world where nature is slowly receding, as we call it the Anthropocene, where man and the effects of man are kind of infecting nature and ecology on the surface level. And so when I think of lawns, I think of both domesticity and middle-class urban agriculture, but also gentrification. And it brings up the connotation of land that was taken away and changed into something else. And so oftentimes you'll see homes develop, particularly the kind of cookie cutter home development projects, as we're going to bring lawns so that way you have a beautiful kind of garden setup for your home. But we don't talk about the natural spaces that these homes and lawns take up, particularly for Indigenous people. And so the lawn functions on a simple level with a denotation of this is a lawn, this is a thing we know in culture. But at its connotation, at its connotative level, it represents both good and bad. Another example could be the dog. The dog is, on a denotative level, an animal. It's often seen alongside man and the development of a man and culture, but it connotates, or on a connotative level, it signifies an idea of the urban household, the family unit, man's best friend, but also like evolution, the idea of wolves becoming dogs. More so now, dogs are starting to become a meme and a place or object of humor. And so you start getting into what else can the dog represent? And for me, the dog is oftentimes this heteropatriarchal image or imaginary of the family unit. Do we have any questions on that? Yes. So we want to think of sign both on its denotative level and its connotative level. And so what is, first off, its denotation? Let's say, for instance, a beer bottle. On a simple denotative reading, a beer bottle is a beer bottle. It's nothing more, it's nothing less, but a beer bottle connotates the idea of parties, of class, of urban splendor, let's say. Sometimes we see beer bottles on the street, and so we think of like capitalistic excess, and we think of refuse, and you could start going down the chain of from positive readings to negative readings, where you're starting to get into homelessness and class and poverty and racism. And so structures such as white supremacy, ableism, ageism, racism, classism utilize objects and signs denotative level in order to say this is just a thing, stop reading into it. Yet the connotation is what often obscures or violates individuals and often brings very traumatic renderings onto societies and cultures. Any other questions? Great question. Overall, we want to think of semiotics as a tool or a theoretical lens we can use when analyzing cultural studies, film and media studies. I'm going to show you an example in a moment of a sign, and we're going to work through the denotation and the connotation together. But if you ever have trouble, remember that signs are just anything that can carry a meaning. So like Disneyland's castle or the Matterhorn, or let's say, for instance, a skyscraper. Any object that carries a meaning, even if it's sound or a certain cultural practice or eating, like the act of eating, that could be analyzed both on a denotative level and a connotative level. I'm going to move to the next slide. And so when we work through signs and semiotics, we want to kind of go down a ladder, if not go up a ladder, as far as analyzing it. So what I like to do first is think about what is the sign or the signified object? What is this thing that we are looking at? And what is its context? And so what do we associate a skyscraper with? What is the skyscraper, sorry, what is it in relation to other things? And so a skyscraper is a very tall building. We see them in large metropolitan cities. There are some skyscrapers that go really tall and really high. There are others that are not so high. But also in connection to, like, let's say homes, skyscrapers kind of build the idea of development and modernity compared to like the simplistic suburban middle class home. And oftentimes there's a lot of money that goes into skyscrapers. And so that's when we start getting into the idea of value and what is the value of this object? How is it valued against other things within relationship to itself or within its system? And how has that value changed within recent years? And so you could think of like the Empire States Building, where growing up, I thought, oh my God, there's this giant building in New York that everybody likes to go to the top of. Whereas now it's like, it's just a building. Like, I went on top of the Sears building in New York once and I was horrified. I felt like the characters in Spider-Man where they're like stuck in the elevator and about to fall down. I don't like tall buildings, and I don't know why. I like thrill rides that are tall, but not tall buildings. And so when we look at the object, think first of what do we associate the object with, what idea, but also what is this object in relation to other objects that are similar. Then we want to look at what does the sign do? How is it constructed in such a way? So what are the colors? What are the materials of the sign? And so a building, they're often gray, black, or white, very minimalist. Some are made of glass, which kind of gives the idea of opulence and power. But other times they're just really ugly. And so we start to think about what that might mean. What are the connotations of that? If the building is made entirely of glass, does it reflect class and superiority and power? Does it reflect literally and metaphorically standing above other buildings and therefore other parts of society? Then we get into finally the significance, or what the article claimed as a way of understanding the sign within culture. So the author looked at the school chair, and we've all in some way or form sat in these chairs, whether a modified version of the chair or we've seen them within culture. The chair is made, they describe, in a way that informs us of education as an institution, particularly a power institution, where the instructor is arguably placed above and before the students, in a way where there's a power struggle, where students are trying to gain knowledge from the instructor, and the instructor is trying to bestow knowledge. And oftentimes that can lead to problematics where students say, well, no, I believe this, and I think this is what I get from this. And the instructor might say, not quite there, friend. Which is why, like, I never like standing up in front of a classroom. I like sitting with the class, because I'm a graduate student and a graduate student instructor. And ultimately, we're all learning with each other. And so in the same way, we want to think about other objects and how not only do we assign them certain values, but we put deeper meanings onto those signs and objects. Does anyone have an object or a sign that they frequently think about within culture, or maybe they're starting to think about? So noise pollution, can you go into that a little bit, Estrella?
Can I talk?
Yes, by all means, go ahead and speak.
Okay, so I think like noise pollution is kind of like a signifier for me, because in more, I'm gonna say urban areas, it's always very loud. whether it be police cars or neighbors or anything
Mhm.
like that. And in more like suburban, more wealthy areas, it's not as
Mhm.
loud. And also same thing with like food, like the markets. I think it's called food deserts.
Yeah.
That is like another signifier for me. So once I tend to when I enter an area that doesn't have as much like fast food or like McDonald's or
Mhm.
anything like that, like that's a signifier for me of, oh, we're entering a more wealthy area.
Yeah, and so if you think about it, I like the idea of noise pollution because that's something that we don't really think about or talk about, but on a denotative level, noise pollution is just a thing. It's a sound. It comes from highways. It comes from construction. It comes from everything that a city or a developing area may have taking place. However, its connotation is oftentimes linked to urbanization, to gentrification, to the reduction of land from indigenous populations. But then it also gets racialized and made tied to class, where those with higher noise pollution are oftentimes racialized as Black, as the other, as lower class. And you start getting into the politics of which communities are affected and which communities does this ultimately harm? And why is it that certain populations are less polluted than others? And how is pollution in some way or form an act of violence, if that makes sense?
Yeah, exactly.
So I have some other signs. Flags, I don't want to get too much into flags because each flag has a different connotation. However, the police as an object or as an enterprise, definitely we can look at the size of the police as an idea and think on a denotative level, police are people doing their jobs. But and as far as their connotations, it really depends on how we look at police. For some in the population, the police are justice, are safety, security, are the defense force of our neighborhoods and our cities. But for others in the population, police can also represent violence, crime, um, brutality, histories tied to slavery. And if you actually look at the history of police, police really started to develop after slavery was destroyed and developed in other networking frameworks. And so police became a way of policing Black and brown bodies within the larger culture. We, of course, don't talk about that because of the denotation versus the connotation. The denotation is we want to protect our neighborhoods from crime and justice. But who or what gets to decide what is crime and justice? And what does that mean for some who are labeled as the ones who produce crime and destroy or test justice in some way or form? Do we have any other questions about signs, their connotations and denotations? Oh, jumped a little bit. Is this starting to make a little bit more sense from us? Does anyone have any questions from the reading maybe? You seem to be doing okay. So I'm going to move to the next slide where we can start practicing this a little bit as a class. And so one of my areas of expertise is animal studies. And so I look at taxidermy, I look at animal representations, I look at animal characters. And so like the film Zootopia to me is a field day because not only is it cute animal characters, but it brings up ideas of eugenics, of racial politics, of policing, of who gets to decide who or what a subject of the city and the police is. And so here we're going to look at taxidermy, and I'm happy that somebody has a taxidermy bison because then we can like think about that. And bicey, oh my God, I love that name. So on the right, we have a taxidermy object, which kind of gives it away as far as what is this object on a denotative level. But let's kind of work through these ideas here to kind of build into the connotation. So what is it? It's a taxidermy stuffed mountain lion or a puma or a cougar. what is the context? Where do we see this object, or where are we currently seeing this object? Can anybody jump in and maybe answer a few of these questions?
These things are seen in museums.
Mm-hmm.
They're seen in like households that hunt.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Cultural spaces. I mean, I feel like taxidermy can go across cultures,
Yeah.
but I feel like we've come to associate it with hunters who put it on their wall or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Good.
but also, having stuff like taxidermy can also be seen as like a class thing, because like
Yeah.
it's like, in what other households will you have the space, the efforts, the time? But I know
Yeah.
that for some other people, they taxidermy animals, but they also eat them, so they use like all of it. So that can
Mm-hmm.
also be, it's not just necessarily like a class thing.
Good, good. So taxidermy has a very long history. And depending on where you look at it, there are some cultures that use taxidermy as a way of giving back, as a way of reverence. And for other cultures, taxidermy is all about the hunt and the idea of the animal as commodity and as an object. That gets a little bit into the connotations, but we definitely see them in museums. We see them in particular libraries or institutional spaces like schools. UCR actually, and this gets into Carly's interjection here, UCR actually has a hallway in the life science building that were we actually on campus, I would have you take a field trip to, and it's just full with glass cabinets of taxidermy of different birds and small animals, prey and predator alike. And I would ask you, okay, the denotative, on the denotative level, these animals signify taxidermy animals. They're just stuffed animals. But on a connotative level, it builds into this idea of the animal as an object of institutional knowledge, the animal as an object of control and power. And definitely we get into discussions of class when you think about who or what can afford a taxidermy animal and what does that mean? And so down here, we have at the last bullet point, as a sign comprised of a signifier or a name, its denotative level, and the line itself and its identity, we start building these ideas through inference and suggestion. So if you look at the mountain lion here, what are some ideas that are brought up? What does this object connotate for us, or what is its connotative reading? Open up the chat again.
I feel like it's like Carly said in the chat. I was kind of thinking the same thing, that the way that did you say it's a mountain lion?
Yeah.
Like the way that it's placed, that the person placed it, just seems like it's not really scary. Like it kind of seems like it's more like elegantly placed than like in a way that's like scary, and like if it'd be like something that's like approachable for you to approach, rather than like when in real life it'd actually be really scary to approach it.
Yeah, and definitely also with what Abigail's saying here, there's definitely a power relationship happening. Do you think that because placing it in this way, do you think that the animal kind of shows its power over us, or maybe do we have power over it in this kind of position?
I feel like it's more power, like the mountain lion has power because of the way that it's kind of like elevated too, kind of in like human context, how like a king would be sitting on a throne, be like very high up and elevated. So I feel like it's kind of like the same kind of parallel there.
Good, good. And then I see here Abigail saying the opposite, that it's almost like we have power over it because we can gaze back at the animal. But what I want to argue, and this is my reading of the taxidermy, is that in the way that the mountain lion is posed, okay, on a denotative level, we're seeing this animal kind of at rest on mountains and a tree, as we might see it within nature. However, on a connotative level, I kind of want to read the mountain as though it's performing an exchange of power, that it's kind of raised up a little bit to where man or its viewers can kind of exchange looks with it and kind of equalizes us as predators or as hunters. Usually, as stated, mountain lions are very threatened by us, but also very threatening to us. And if there's any like narrative of going out into the San Gabriel Mountains or Los Angeles Mountains and running into an animal, it's oftentimes a mountain lion, and we of course have to question our safety. But here, the animal seems approachable, and in some ways, almost like humans are kind of equal to this animal because there's no threat here between us or the animal. Of course, the animal is already dead, and so it was threatened by us. But here, we can kind of commune with the mountain lion itself based upon the fact that compared to other mountain lions, the sign is arguing a different connotation. And so here are some points. So with taxidermy, we oftentimes see the animal as an object of scientific, cultural, and ideological interest. The animal itself becomes an object of spectacle. We get to gaze upon it and then start normalizing how animals are objects of consumption. It's readily available for us to materially consume it, but also culturally and socially, because I can go to a library and see the taxidermy of a dog and think, that's a cute dog. Well, the next time I see a dog, I'm already going to start comparing that dog to the taxidermy animal and thinking how it relates in some way or another. And this is how that cultural mythology or ideology begins to develop, in the sense that signs start to build on each other and inform our understanding of things or ideas. As well as we've argued, this taxidermy informs our relationship to nature and whether we are above, below, or equal with it. And sometimes taxidermy might actually show that nature is wild and unruly compared to civil white human society. I say that particularly because the animal is very much light-furred. If you look at the face, the chest, there's this kind of echo with this idea of the whitened animal, where it's not threatening, but actually in some way in commune with us, compared to animals like the bison or the gorilla, which start to get racialized because of the way cultural mythologies tie Africa to certain populations. Does that make sense? It's very much tied to histories of colonial violence and equations of cultural mythologies that are very violent and very damaging. Okay, I see I got it. And so you want to think about how on a connotative level, any object can become a technology of power, of violence, of sometimes even resistance. You can look at various signs, various logos or practices that start to connotate resistance against systems of violence, just as other signs really bring up violence as a tool or weaponry against other civil societies and populations. We're going to move on now, but if we have any other questions, we can refer back to the mountain lion or maybe another sign of similar usage. Do we have any questions so far, or are we doing okay? All right, so right here in the chat. So it's almost like the connotative level of a sign goes beyond the denotative level of a sign and goes into more significance and depth. Exactly. Let's say, for instance, my Funko Pop here. On a denotative level, this is a toy. This is a collectible. It's Shere Khan from Tailspin, or the Jungle Book from the old Saturday morning Disney Channel cartoons. But when we start to think about how it shows up in culture, the toy, not necessarily the character, but the toy, where it shows up in culture, who buys this, why they buy it, how they buy it, you start to think of this object as tied to class, as tied to socialization and pop culture. And really, you want to think deeper into it. And so when we get to the commercial, we want to think about disability in the same way. How's disability on a connotative level informative of certain ideas within culture. Does that kind of help in that regard? So definitely anytime you watch a film or you watch something happen on the news, so like the protests. Recently, there was a video of a transgender woman being arrested and pulled into an unmarked van by a bunch of men. And of course, people tried to stop that. So on a denotative level, that moment is what it is. A transgender woman being pulled into a van by unidentified individuals who are possibly with the state or possibly with white supremacist movements. We don't know. And it's starting to come out that maybe they are tied to the state itself. But on a denotative level, that moment, that act of pulling a transgender woman into the unmarked van connotates ideas of state violence, state brutality, the brutality against transgender women and men and non-binary individuals, and very much how the political world that we live in within the United States is totally rupturing in its own form or matter. I also want to ask, as stated here, the connotative level of a sign is almost always related to the system in which the sign is located in. Woo, that's a big question. Yes, so to break that down a little bit, a sign is always in conversation with another sign. So an object is always in conversation with objects that are similar to it or in adjacency to it. So let's say, for instance, a really souped up, fancy car is in conversation with other cars similar to it that might not be as fancy. Or a McDonald's cheeseburger is in communication with other cheeseburgers out there. So let's say, for instance, a McDonald's cheeseburger on a denotative level is a cheeseburger. It's food, it's sustenance. Maybe not the best, but it's food. On a connotative level, it represents ideas of class, of classability, of society disabling certain populations from healthy food and adequate living support systems. Because when you compare the McDonald's cheeseburger to a cheeseburger that's not all that different, but has like a slice of mushroom on it that goes for like $200, you start thinking about, okay, this is not just a cheeseburger. This represents so much more. Why is it that in certain parts of America, someone can have a mushroom burger for $200 like it's a normal everyday thing, whereas in other parts of the United States, it's normal and accepted that someone could have a McDonald's cheeseburger for every day of the or every meal of the day. Does that help out? That's going to take a little time to get into, particularly when you start thinking of systems and relationships between signs. But right now, just think about objects that can carry meaning in all sorts of ways. And why is it that we get those ideas, and how is it that we get those ideas when we compare that object to something in its kind of vicinity or comparison to other things? Any other questions before we go on?
I have a question. What about words? Because you mentioned objects, but what about like words? They have connotations, right? Or
Sorry, say that again, the word?
like words, just like in general, like just words.
Words. Could you write that down for me? Sorry. My ears aren't the best. Oh, words, yes. Words can carry meaning, definitely, when we think of them like as a thing. So like right here, let's see. If you look at the meme at the bottom, there's the question you, or the word you. You can have many different connotations based upon how it's utilized. And so if I am talking with a friend and I say you, that could be a gesture. But if you carries a tone when I'm pointing at someone, it really depends on how it's being utilized in the moment, and it can very much carry particular connotations. As well, we know other phrases and words out there that do carry violent connotations, not only for what the word is, but the history that is attached to those words. And so I would say, yes, words do carry connotations, but it really depends on how the word is utilized and what is the history behind that word. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. And so when we get to the commercial and we start thinking of the term disabled, we want to start thinking, what does that term mean, and who does that mean this particular meaning for, and why? So I'm going to move to the next slide here. By all means, stop me at any moment. But we're getting now into the article by Munich. And so what Munich really does is break down disability studies and its development and how it's become much more than what it started as. And so disability studies started as connected to gender, civil rights movements, race movements, LGBTQIA resistance movements, so like Pride, and definitely the resultant factors of the AIDS crisis. And really, disability studies came in when gender studies, queer theory, and critical race studies were already moving and shaking things up. And scholars realized we need to be thinking about how disability plays a factor in not only our social lives, but also in culture. And that's where Munich really starts to press into the idea of disability studies as a methodology. A methodology is a particular theoretical way of going about something. Think of it like a practice. So when I think of methodology, I think of more biology and the sciences. What is my methodology? How am I going about something? Here, she argues that disability studies itself needs to be a way we go about cultural and social analysis. And so one of the concerns she does bring up is how disability has been tied to subject identity and subject politics, particularly around the neoliberal identity. Has anyone heard of neoliberalism before? Maybe can give their own definition of the term? Okay, so I see Dee Dee saying yes. Could you give a definition maybe, or the way that you understand it, Dee Dee?
Yeah, I can. I find it's a pretty hard thing to define, especially. So it's the current system we live under, first and foremost, right?
Yeah. Good.
And it's the power structure that really I guess enables our modern capitalism in most of the Western world and outside of the Western world, which is usually forced upon outside of the Western world by imperialistic forces and the like.
Good. And so you really touched into something that gets tricky, as we all know. It's very hard to define these capitalistic structures, but the idea of neoliberalism is something that's been culturally built up from this idea and history of imperialism. As far as imperialism and the history of that, really you had settlers coming onto a land and taking claim of things, objects, and land spaces, and definitely animals and other cultures, and saying, this is mine, I'm putting claim onto it. And so the individual started to kind of build up as someone who can make claims, purchases, and definitely substantialize or develop themselves by what they owned and who they were. And so ownership and property and the possibility of having ownership really got enmeshed with individuality and the identity of one person. And so neoliberalism looks to how individuals themselves, like let's say in college, are their own entrepreneurs, their own kind of future makers. We go to school and we invest in ourselves, is kind of the language of neoliberalism, to gain a certain future or a certain product that is available to us because we've invested for so long. And definitely this mode of thinking has been placed particularly by Western imperial cultures. Because if you think of indigenous populations, if you think of populations outside the United States, and particularly in the East and the Southeast, you have other cultures that are more community-based, more based in family, based in history. And yet Western imperialism has said, that's nice, but really it's all about you and the individual and what you can make of yourself through the power that you hold. And so it's in everything. When you look at movies, the structure of a movie or a narrative is an individual person wanting something and working to obtain that. That's neoliberalism, thinking this person has to go about getting what they want because it's important to them. But that's capitalism, plain and simple. If you think of the more recent movie, Parasite, you have these main characters and their family affected by capitalism because they want what the wealthy have, and what the wealthy have has been created and commodified through generations and histories of taking from other people. And so that's why at the middle part of the movie, I'm not going to spoil it too much, you start to see the characters fighting for what they feel they have claim of in their own way because of the way capitalism informs individuality. Does that make sense for people? Do we have any trouble with that? I'm going to get into how it ties into disability in a moment. Can't drink too much water. Last time I had to go to the bathroom really bad, or badly. You seem to be doing okay. And so, yeah, okay, I see yes. So the problem with neoliberalism in as far as political movements and resistance movements is that because of capitalism and the way it works with neoliberalism and the idea of identity, things like race and class can be subsumed into the system through identity politics. And so if you look at critical race studies, there's the term intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. And what's happened with that term, because it's become useful within the academic field, it started as a way of discussing the violence that particularly Black and brown women face, not only as being Black and brown, but also being a woman and living in a particular part of culture or socioeconomic class. And these layerings and the intersections of all of it affect an individual, particularly because of their race and place in society. And yet this term has been utilized to fuel white supremacist movements, it's been taken to fuel other projects that are not necessarily tied to critical race studies. And so what it does is it takes this project that was a way of speaking for a disenfranchised community and saying, well, we want that too, and it's useful for us. And so this commodification really starts to get problematic. And that's where Munich is really getting into the throes of disability studies, and how one of the things we want to realize is that critical race studies as well as disability studies have always been about engaging actively with cultural and material productions of difference. It's always been attributed to social change and rupturing the fabric of white supremacy, of able-bodied violence, of ageism, sexism, and definitely queer and homosexual phobias. Does that make sense? Move my chat down so I can make sure I see. These work as well in some way as my notes, since it's right there. So in the way that neoliberalism takes on ideas of the individual to fuel itself, we want to make sure that we're always thinking about what is this speaking towards and who is this speaking for? Who is this work? What is this work that I'm doing? What is it giving back to, and why is it important? If we're taking critical race theory, we want to make sure that it is respectful and taking power back to and racialized structures. And when we think of disability studies, we want to think of it as a methodology that really works to change how we think of disability and who or what is disabled versus who is not. I'm going to move forward on the next slide. And so, again, it's getting to that idea that we want to locate disability studies in social justice work. Just as critical race studies, just as queer theory has kind of set the bar for us developing out of women and sexuality studies and gender studies, we want to do that work, and we need to recognize that this is important for many people out there. And particularly when we start getting into cultural criticism, we want to realize how much of our social structure and our capitalistic structure is based upon the ableism of white masculinity and settler imperial structures itself. And so we want to think about how disability has been utilized as a way of creating racial boundaries, racism, racial violence. We want to think about how disability has rationalized homophobia, transphobia, racism, and more. Think of the AIDS crisis. This was a moment where a large part of our population were disabilized and were killed because of the inadequacy of science to handle the virus. But particularly, it disabled queer and gay bodies and lesbian bodies because it deemed them as the other. Really, disability here worked as a way of saying, they have it, they're different, they're in danger, we can't be infected by that, or we too will get infected and disabled. And so disability works in multiple ways. Not only is it a term that describes an experience, and it can be something that is reclaiming for many individuals, like for me, my identity on the spectrum and somebody with anxiety and PTSD. I claim that because it gives me the way that I see the world, and I can critique the world in particular ways. But for others, disability has been utilized to construct and mobilize violence. We also want to think about how disability pathologizes what a normal body or identity is. Because I'm on the autistic spectrum, I'm neurodivergent. I diverge from what is argued the typical able-bodied identity. And yet, I also step away from that because the able-bodied neurotypical individual, it can be based in whiteness, in racism, in ableism, in all these problematic structures. And that doesn't mean that I'm not white or I don't see myself as white, but it means that I'm critiquing whiteness and the way that it disenfranchises and disables individuals within society at large. What are our thoughts about that? What do we think about social justice work through disability studies and critical race theory and these other practices of the academic field? Has anyone come across this before, or does anyone have any thoughts about it, personal thoughts, or maybe just ways we can go about practicing this? So I know a lot of you are in the sciences. For those of you who are, do any of you notice like sexism or racism or classism that happen within the sciences, whether biology, neurobiology, microbiology, engineering? And do you feel things like disability studies, gender and sexuality studies, queer theory, and critical race studies, do you feel these can be of use to you, let's say in the sciences, and a way to describe your own personal experiences?
So I'm not in like the scientists, I'm a comparative literature major.
Uh-huh.
But I took a gender and sexuality class for fall quarter.
Yeah.
And we read Care Work Dreaming Disability Justice
Uh-huh.
by Leah Lakshmi. I kind of forgot her name, but
Mm-hmm.
what I know so far. And like it really went into like the intersectionality between like disabled, like people who are disabled, people of color, and like
Mm-hmm.
queer people or LGBTQIA plus people, and
Mm-hmm.
how like it's kind of all like intertwined.
Yeah.
And how like at some points when like people with disability were trying to advocate. It was mainly like the people of color with disabilities that were trying to create like this movement, and then it was like kind of taken,
Yeah.
and then like I guess I want to say in a way commodified to like fit other things. And so then once again, like the disadvantaged people with disabilities.
Oh, I lost you there. I think your mic went out for whatever reason. But just to touch on that, I totally agree with you. You want to think of commodification typically practiced by the cultures that feel they are left out. So think of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a movement to bring attention to the way that systems of power leave out Black and brown individuals, and the way that society itself disables Black people from the same argued same structures they should be available to them. I say same because the way that culture has built itself upon has always been built on the idea of white ableism and Western exceptionalism. And so when you think of like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, we the people, again, you want to think of the connotation of we. Who is we, and who are the people, and who is accepted into that versus others? And so these topics of racism, classism, sexism, and disability are very much entangled and enmeshed together. And then going to Carly down here, I see it in patient care systems. I volunteer at RCH, and the demographics and populations served are vastly different, though they are being treated for the same way. Very much so. And as well, you hear stories online, let alone in just social communication, of Black women being treated differently and not getting the medical attention they need because they are different from, arguably different from, white women. And it's problematic. One of my colleagues just had a baby during the COVID crisis, and we were worried how things were going to go out, because not only is there a pandemic going on, but the history of Black women being able to handle more is tied to genealogies and histories of slavery that just don't need to be here anymore. And then in engineering as a whole, it tends to be male dominated, but with bioengineering seems to be more balanced. And yeah, it really depends. And we also want to think about how fields are changing and starting to learn from these. But of course, some fields are just rife with sexism, racism, and ableism. No, it's okay. It's okay. Internet disconnects all the time. And then we see a journal here from Carly, prevalence of unprofessional social media content among young vascular surgeons. Yeah, so I do need to go on before we finish today, so we can discuss the commercial itself. So St. Jude Shriners Hospital, the boardroom. Like I said, I read through half of the submissions, and I think you guys are doing great work. There's a lot of places where I'm like, yes, structure, analysis, it's there, it's great. But also I'm seeing where we can develop and strengthen that. So far, no one has really shown themselves to be, of course, the weaker link, which is based on ableism and intelligence disability and all those problematic things. Everyone is showing the different levels of where they're at in writing. And I think it's great that you all are taking this time to develop yourself and share your knowledge. And the way we saw this commercial, we all saw this commercial in different various ways that are, I wouldn't say it's bad or wrong to be different, but it shows the various questions that are being asked about the way culture produces the idea of disability and how the commercial works both to showcase that, but also maybe even disrupt disability. So moving into it, in context or on the denotative level, we see disability here within the commercial projected as a physical impairment or an injury or a medical crisis requiring, if not necessitating, research and financial support. We as well see disability as an umbrella term. We see kids of all different disabilities taking part in social communication and working together with each other to think of something warm and heartfelt, and as far as giving back to the donors. I don't know, and it's a question we'll get into later on whether or not invisible disabilities are represented, but definitely around the table, the boardroom table, we see that disability comes all in different shapes, forms, and appearances, which is great and as far as representation. But we also see that disability is a social and emotional concern where we need rapid attention geared to the community of those with disabilities. The television is very aware that this is a serious issue, and we need to remind people constantly that those with disabilities cannot be forgotten, just as the world keeps on developing. And so my mom watches the TV show, The Waltons and Bonanza, and they oftentimes continue to replay these commercials. And I think of that repetition and the circular repeat as a way of making the older population not forget that those with disabilities are important and are still around, particularly in times when you watch media like the Waltons where disability is not taken up like it is today. But finally, we see in context and on the denotative level how disability and the embodiment or status one individual may have is tied to who that individual is. And in some ways can be something of claim if that person with a disability chooses to take claim of it. Not a lot of people do. A lot of people see it as something we need to heal from or get over. And that could be both helpful and problematic depending on how that person values or sees their disability. But for others, disability is what makes them who they are. For me, my disability allows me to get really intense and passionate about a certain subject, more so than others. And so when I get to work in that field, I really get to be excited and get happy that people are excited about my excitement about that subject. However, something we don't see with the commercial as well are disabilities that are not shown or not easily on camera. And we don't really get to think about those invisible impairments that are very much important to us within culture. As well, something that is concerning is around the table, we don't get to see a lot of Black or Indigenous people of color. And that could be tied to maybe they just didn't have child actors from the hospital to participate. But it also brings up the issue that we don't often talk about Black, Indigenous people of color who are very much just more disenfranchised than possibly white disabled children because of food scarcity, of food deserts, of adequate mental health care and adequate attention through the medical system. Is everybody on the same page here? Are we doing okay? I see yes. I hear yes. So there's a lot of good and bad with this commercial. And as far as denotations, watching these commercials, I see a certain population is represented when there's much more of a population that is affected by disability. Everyone who has a disability is affected, yes, but we're not necessarily talking about those within society who are disenfranchised and disabled by these systems of power. And then, of course, we get into the connotations, as Estrella points out. The music and imagery possibly adds to how disability is commonly within culture and society infantilized. It's often shown as a way of being seen as less than, as childlike. Certain disabilities, like if you think of actors who are shorter in height, are shown as children or non-human and goblins and droids within Star Wars. And we really get into problematics of how disability is mediated with connotations throughout culture and media at large. Semiotically, disability is normalized and naturalized as well as spectacle. If you follow the camera and the way it looks at disability, it takes a medical gaze in which we're shown people's disabilities right up front. And whether this is good or bad, it normalizes in some way a culture in which, in order to understand someone with disabilities, we need to see what their disability is. And that could get very problematic and troubling. For me, myself, I share what my disabilities are because I feel, again, it informs who I am and allows people to socialize or communicate with me in ways that are nonviolent. But for others, you don't want to ask somebody what their disability is. You don't want to pay attention to their disability directly, because that could be very disenfranchising and very disabling for them. We don't, of course, hear conversation on socioeconomic class and how some people, while this children's hospital is there to help them, it's not helping everyone. And so we want to ask, who is not in the conversation around the table? Who is not able to get these resources, despite the fact that we are donating our money to the hospitals to help people who don't have access to the support? And then the commercial also heavily relies on pathos and physical disability rather than informing and educating. Good. A point that a lot of you brought up with the commercial is that it's really built upon the idea of pathos and the use of disability to gain access to funds and economic support. That ties into neoliberalism and how disability is utilized in some way as an entrepreneurial skill. And so again, there are these intersections and these connections that could be both used in positive ways, but also negative ways. And through disability studies, we want to think about, what is the media doing? How is it framing disability, and what is it using disability for? Now, St. Jude's Hospital is a nonprofit organization. And so we want to take that into account. Where's the money going towards, and is it really helping these individuals and these actors? These actors are actually from the hospital. And so in their way, they are benefiting from this commercial, hopefully. However, in certain cases, that might not be true. And so we want to think about that and how disability becomes a tool of capitalistic gain, let alone moralistic or social gain for certain populations. Go ahead, yes?
Yeah, so sorry, on that point, I was actually thinking exactly about that, about
Yeah.
how they have like child actors and they sort of portray them in a way where it kind of makes you wonder, like, all right, so we know like a lot of charities tend to be pretty manipulative and like they will move funds around for their own gain. So I actually looked into it and I found that Shriners Hospital actually has around $9 billion, which is one of like the wealthiest charities, but they also allocate about 82.5% of their funds towards expenses like for the children, leaving 10% for administrative expenses. So I mean, I did feel like it was kind of painting the children and their disabilities in a way such that pathos was being utilized, but at the same time, I feel that in a way is, well, it does help, right? Because as someone said in the chat, like it does pull on like the white savior complex. But I feel that it kind of calls into like question, like, do the ends justify the means? Because I mean, they are like very clearly making the money to be able to help these children. And I even looked into it further and found out that Shriners cares for children without medical insurance for free. And so, I mean, like it is doing good. And I mean, it's kind of, it's like using like really like cheap tactics for the money. So, I mean, would we say that that's worth it or no, or what? Like, I'm kind of confused on like where everyone else stands on that.
Yeah, we are running low on time, but if we want, let's discuss that a little bit. How do we go about this? Do we feel comfortable with the commercial? Do we not? For me, I feel that it's a lot of playing on that white savior complex, because these commercials are typically geared towards white, able-bodied, upper middle class, upper class individuals who have money to donate. And that does bring up questions that we need to work through as a culture. Good point.
Can I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, I agree. Like it does do good. That we're not going to take away from that. It's like it's a good cause, but I feel like things like that over time can get kind of like it can get messy when it is helping children, but it isn't helping all the children. It isn't helping like you were saying, like indigenous kids or any like kids whose parents can't even don't even know where to go and find like resources or anything, or children in like different countries that can't. My stepdad for a while donated to St. Jude's, and it was more of like a feel good thing for him. It was like I'm donating. I feel good. I'm happy they're sending me this poster because I know that I'm helping.
Yeah.
And like that's good, but it kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth that people feel like a savior for doing that. They feel like, oh, I'm doing something, I'm helping them, because I feel like we do need to help people with disability, but they're not all of them are asking to be saved. They're asking for help with funds for surgeries because our system is inherently flawed. So I just don't like when people have that complex of, I am saving their life, without me like they wouldn't have this and all this stuff. I don't know, but that like that's just me. And like I have a lot of family who are disabled. Like my very close aunt has cerebral palsy, and people who like help her always have this mentality of yeah, like I'm doing good by helping her, and like it's like they do it for them and not really for her, or they don't do it just for it to be like an equity kind of thing. So then I've become very hypercritical of like, are you helping because you truly want to, or because you just want to feel good about yourself? And I feel like that's something that the commercial does. It makes the other person feel good rather than informing or saying anything else, or saying like, we need this money for these surgeries and this and that. It's more of just like pity, sympathy, which works, but I'm just saying I'm critical of that.
Go ahead.
I would definitely agree. Now that like you guys bring it up, that like it might not be justified, but I mean at the same time, can we like really assume that everyone goes into this thinking of like these children as like lesser and like in need of this dire help? Because I mean I feel like there are definitely still people out there who genuinely care and want to make a difference. And I mean I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing that people feel good about helping other people. I just feel that maybe I don't know, I kind of feel like we're going out on the assumption that feeling good about helping someone else comes at the expense of that person's dignity, such that we feel good about helping someone else because we look down upon them. And I also have close family that is disabled, and I mean it does feel good to help them, not because I look down upon them, but because I know that certain activities aren't always easy for them, and it's not easy for them to ask for help. So I mean kind of just helping makes their life easier and saves them face from sort of like feeling like they're burdening anyone else, right?
Now the issue that we all are getting to here is that it's good to help others, and it's great to donate to a cause that is meant to help others, particularly those who are often disenfranchised or seen as other within society. But really what the issue is bringing up is that, or what the discussion is bringing up is that this assistance doesn't really get to the fact of the structures of disability and the way that capitalism and identity politics have become commodified and utilized within itself. And so it's good to help others, yes, but oftentimes that use or the language of helping becomes a way of distracting from the violence of labeling others as disabled. And so let's say, for instance, for me, if I go into a situation where I'm trying to socialize as myself, and then I need to pull out because I'm hyperstimulated and I need to go chill with the cat and just relax and kind of stim for a while, others are looking at me like, what is she doing? Why is she kind of pulling off? And so there at that moment, I become the other. But once people realize that I'm on the spectrum, they start to see, oh, maybe I can help her in some ways, which is great. But also, in what way in other places is helping becoming a tool to, as we discussed, to bring in profit and to bring in help that doesn't go to those who are in need? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's this problem where capitalism and neoliberalism starts to fragment at the hinges, so to speak, and it locates disability problematically on the body, and that this is an issue while also simultaneously not realizing that it's commodifying this, or maybe does realize that it commodifies those with disabilities. And that's kind of where with disability studies, we want to have these discussions and questions of care and what does it mean to care. And there are actual books that are written about this, one called Care Work, where you start to question, how is care a way in which we can turn into a political movement for those who are disenfranchised and disabled? But how is care also utilized to fuel white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and much more violent as well structures out there? So we are just about out of time. I do want to give you your break, but before we go, I do want to point out that one thing that somebody brought up really well is that although disability here is conveyed in various forms, both good and bad, the moments in where the children are imagining and kind of going into a cartoon world, they see themselves with their disabilities doing things like going to space and operating in a capitalist society where they're not necessarily judged by their disabilities. And so this place of the imagination, the play space and cartoons becomes a mobilizing space of really political work, where yes, the children are being utilized to fund an organization, whether it helps them or not. But in the moments where they can go into their imagination and speak maybe for themselves, they realize that disability is a part of them and they need to be recognized as living individuals, whether or not they have a disability. Does that make sense? It gets into that idea of who or what can label this as a disability, who or what can help me and why. And really, maybe it argues that it is up to the individual with a disability to make those terms themselves and to really bring forth how disability studies needs to be recognized as a political movement based on rights and claim and who or what is disabled and disenfranchised and what that means for them.
So
So go ahead.
I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead.
At that point, would you say that maybe like the good move for organizations such as St. Jude's would be to have more of people who align with these people who have disabilities more on like the board and in the like administrative positions, such that like disabled people are able to sort of take control and act in a way that benefits them more, such than just having people create pity and then sort of weaponizing that against them? Like, would you say that that would be helpful, or would you say like the fix goes deeper than that?
I would say that would be useful. A lot of times, particularly like in issues of ethnic studies and race, a lot of people go for the language of diversity, but really diversity is kind of a band-aid where we'll bring somebody in, but the structure of, let's say, ableism or white supremacy doesn't really change. And so the conversations need to develop, but bringing people in with disabilities to help out with the organization or to run the organization themselves can really be beneficial in ways, because it can allow for us to re-alter our understanding of disability, let alone the system that either commodifies or utilizes disability as a way of structuring power. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank
Yeah,
you.
so we are out of time here today. I want to thank you all for those who stayed past 12:10. I know we talked about break. I realized that I might need to cut down a little bit on these PowerPoints and lectures and adjust them so we can make sure we get our break. But thank you all for participating in the discussion. Next class, we'll get into structuring essays and really starting to analyze disability through, in this case for Thursday or tomorrow, metaphor. We'll be looking at film clips from iRobot. And we do have one more reading for this week. So try and get through that if you can, but I'll definitely cover that over the next lecture. Do we have any questions before you go, if you haven't left already? No questions so far? So go ahead and read Disability Goes Cultural, where we start to look at how we can analyze disability and disability studies through a cultural film and cinema lens. And then watch the scenes from iRobot. They're linked under course materials, or they should be. If not, then I'll get a bunch of emails and I'll change that. But if you also haven't met with me but wish to, feel free to email me and set up an iLearn or a Google Docs appointment through Zoom. So that way we can get a chance to talk about this more and really set you up for success in the first paper. Please, by all means, go ahead and get a chance to look at the prompt under assignments and essay prompts. I will be discussing it tomorrow, but I want to make sure you have kind of an idea of what the essay is. With that said, I will see you guys tomorrow. Take care, stay safe, watch some TV and movies, think about the things you consume, and I will see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. Take care, please. This will be posted onto YouTube if anyone you know missed this. And by all means, email me as soon as possible if you have a question, whether or not you think that question is dumb.